Before we dive into today's conversation with Kim John Payne, a conversation for parents and for everyone who has the pleasure of being around children, we want to remind you that we have a special opportunity coming up just for therapists. The first Practice of Being Seen retreat is being held in the Catskill Mountains this August. For more about revision, explore your stories, shape your future, please visit us at practiceofbeingseen.com/events.
Today's episode is brought to you by Plum Deluxe, organic, fair trade, loose leaf teas made fresh every week. The practice of being seen is about understanding who you really are and daring to share your truth with the world.
This is a conversation with and for seekers, creators, and holders of transformation. We believe that stories shape relationships, and relationships shape stories.
This is Rebecca Wong, relationship therapist and founder of Connectfulness.
And this is Marisa Gowdy, writer and storytelling coach for healers.
And this is the practice of being seen. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional.
Today's guest is Kim John Payne. He has been quietly and passionately working to help tens of thousands of people give voice to the feeling that something is not okay about the new normal of overwhelm that surrounds so many of us. He offers doable ways to realize the hopes and values we have for ourselves and build deep connections with our children that gives families resiliency and simple joy. A consultant who's worked with more than 230 schools in the United States and educational associations around the world, Kim's books have been translated into 27 languages. His 2009 book, Simplicity Parenting, was a #1 bestseller, and his next highly anticipated book, How to Be at Your Best When Your Kids Are at Their Worst, will be published in 2018. And now, our conversation with Kim John Payne.
Kim, I'm so happy to have you with us here today.
Thank you.
Kim, I've gotten the pleasure of seeing you speak twice locally in my community, and each time I walk away with such gems that just resonate on such a deep personal and professional level. And so I'm so excited that you agreed to come on our show today.
Oh, totally my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for taking us up on it. You know, the last talk that I went to with you, you were talking about how we can be our best when our kids are at their worst. And there was a lot in that talk that deeply resonated about the idea of pinging and how we all kind of find our grounding and our safety, our safe places, and how we hold and see each other. And I was wondering if that would maybe be a great place for us to start. If you can maybe talk into that a little bit and let us know how that resonates for you.
Well, sure. You know, one of the questions and one of the, like, how can we be at our best when our kids are at our worst? And one of the sort of myriad layers in that lofty aim of trying to be centered when our kids are uncentered is to know when our kids are trying to get their bearings, when they've lost their bearings, and what they're doing essentially is trying to, almost like they're using us to they're like echolocating. They're trying to use us to find where they're emotionally at because they've lost it. And the metaphor that often occurs to me is pinging, which is what mariners do at sea. They send out a sonic sound, which sounds like a ping apparently, and it hits an object and bounces back, and they do that 3 times. They triangulate and they get their bearings. And it's kind of interesting that our sort of emotional way of referring to ourselves when we don't know where we stand is we've lost our bearings. Well, when our kids have lost their bearings, they ping us, you know. And I've never met a disobedient kid in my life. I've only ever met disoriented ones, and I've been a counselor to a family counselor, a school counselor. I've met some right little rascals, I can tell you. But I just don't. The more I worked over the years, the more I've become convinced that these kids are not being willfully, very rarely at least, being willfully defiant. They're being disoriented, and what they're doing is they're pinging us in order to get their bearings to be oriented. because it's one of the most painful psychological states we can be in, is to be disoriented. We often underestimate it, but it's tough. And our kids, of course, they're going to turn to us because we're the most consistent, trustworthy people in their lives very often. And so it makes sense that we get pinged. But the most important thing about our kids using us to echolocate is that it's a bit of a, I've been told by many parents, a game changer when we understand this and really take it in, not just sort of like, oh yeah, okay, maybe I understand that. But when we really take it in, it shifts a whole bunch in terms of how we can be at our best when our kids are at their worst. Because if we understand why they're doing it, and then we just look look at our kids with inquisitiveness, being inquisitive rather than accusative, and we can look at them and wonder, inwardly have a inside talk, inner talk, and just wonder, I wonder why you're so lost. I wonder what's going on for you. On a dime, that moves us from our fight or flight brain, our amygdala, adrenaline, cortisol, feeling challenged, feeling what one mother called the red mists rising. I'll never forget that term. I didn't know it at the time, but it's a great description.
So
and
perfect.
It moves, yeah, isn't it? And it
Yes.
moves us from that reactive place, and it moves us into a wondering. And the moment we move into wondering, out of fight or flight, we've moved into different parts of our being and parts of our brain.
It strikes me that that's also an invitation for curiosity and creativity.
Well, it's exactly that, actually. That's exactly what it is. Because when we move into our limbic system in our brain, thereabouts, we're moving into the let's play brain, into the let's cooperate brain, or the I wonder brain. And our kids pick it up really, really quickly, because when they've lost it, when they're angry, when they're defiant, when they're sullen, it's really helpful to remember that they're at their most vulnerable. So it only takes a little bit of a change in our emotional gesture for them to pick up that we're actually a safe base rather than the shouty, scary person that we don't want to be.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's occurring to me as I hear you say this, it feels so liberating to feel like I'm being pinged rather than I'm being triggered.
Well put. I've never thought of it like that. But it's and the two are like bedfellows, aren't they? They sort of ride on a knife edge, those two. And just to understand that, because otherwise, why would our kids, when they're little, do that totally challenging stuff 5 foot away from us and then deny it? It's like, is there some undiscovered mental illness in the I just stood there and watched you do it, and then the child is saying, "Oh, I did not,"
right.
And you think, "Oh my." Well, what's happening is that we're being pinged, and I don't know if you've noticed, but when we get pinged a lot is when kids are going through big changes developmentally. Mm-hmm. They're 2, 2.5. 9 years old is another example. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and there's a lot of pinging about the house at the moment. That's another one. And the other time that kids use us to get their bearings is when there's big changes in the home, when there's perhaps a bereavement or a big house, you've moved home, or a parent has lost their job, or something big has happened. Then our kids echolocate us as well.
They need us to be a secure base. They need a place that they know they can come back to and that it's safe, and then they can go explore.
I know, but isn't it strange how they do it so in a way that is often less than attractive?
We forget sometimes that that's our job, is just to be that secure, safe place. It's so easy to forget.
Yeah, and it's really helpful to remember that it's worse for them. If they're being angry or defiant or sullen, it's hard for us. It's really hard, but it's much harder for them.
They're actually trapped in that little brain with that storm swirling around and not knowing what to do and to find their way.
Right. Whereas we've got choices. At that moment, they don't.
And it's interesting as you're listing off times in which, a lot of pinging happened. I realized it happened at our house when my daughter learned how to read, because words came to her like in a tremendous download. And it took my husband and I a couple months to recognize books did this to her. And we love books, but it was so hard for her to have her perspective on the world change so much, because now every cereal box is an entire world she has to read rather than just being the place where the Cheerios are.
Yes, or the super expensive granola.
Yes, that too. We mix it up at our house, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, gosh, that's smart.
I love this part that you talk about when you talk about how when they're lost, they're at their most vulnerable. I've also heard you say that they're also at their most receptive in those moments.
Yeah, they are super receptive because they are thin. All the layers between a child and the world, all the things that they love to do, all the little rituals they have, and stuff and friends and books and toys. None of that helps them very much when they're really, really angry or sad. That stuff gets fairly quickly stripped away, and so that's when they're super receptive. And the way in which we react at that time will basically set the tone for what's going to happen. And, do we go poking at it? Do we inflame it? Or do we not? There's a lovely little story that metaphor, which, gosh, I learned a lot from this. When I was a teacher, I was actually a school counselor, but I would teach some classes, and I would take the children down to play some games on this lovely big green field we had. But we would play chasing games, and some of those kids would rather, run to London than get tagged. So I had this great big 500 meters of rope, and it was very tangly. So I decided to get a rope winder, and we would wind up the rope, and that took care of that. But my dear friend and colleague, he would run his lessons right up to when the bell would go. So he'd take 500 meters of rope and he would throw it in the garden shed. And you cannot believe how tangled that would become. So down I'd bring my or classes, and we'd open the door, and there would be 500 meters of tangled rope. And the children would all shout, "Hooray!" They'd really like it. And I'll explain why, because they would set their watches and they would see how quickly they could untangle it. Now, we found out the secret of how to untangle this huge amount of rope. And that was two things. Firstly, they would send two children right up to the top floor of a rather tall building, four-story high building, to open the window and look out from above and help us guide what we were doing by looking out the window and shouting down to us. That was number one. And number two, we learned never to pull on a tangle. We learned to open it up and create space. And there were some children who just couldn't resist pulling on the tangle. And the children out the window up in the building would call out, "Sam, Sarah, don't pull on it, And so we'd create space and open it and open it and open it. And eventually, usually within 3 minutes, pretty quick for 500 meters of rope, we could have that thing completely opened out, but you never pull on a tangle.
What a beautiful metaphor just for life and relationships. Yes.
And so when our kids are angry, do we go pulling on the tangle, or do we create space? But where we create space, first and foremost, is within ourselves.
Yeah. That's reminding me of a shift I've recently made in my home. where instead of hustling and trying to get everybody ready and doing all the stuff to get us out in the morning, instead of letting myself get upset, I'll just lay down on the floor. And then we end up with a puppy pile and everybody's all connected. And from that point, movement happens.
Yeah. The saying that I like to turn around is don't just, it's a sort of turning around to the saying, and the saying that I use is don't just do something, stand there.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Because if we can just stand there, you know the saying count to 10, like when you're upset, count to 10. It's actually not true. It's 3. Count to 3. Neurologically, it's 3. If we can count to 3, if we can just stand there and not engage in that kind of angry way, a lot changes. And the sort of interesting dynamic about, I don't know if you caught that part of the story, when the kids went up into the high building and looked out the window. But for me, with family life, with life in general, colleagues, friends, whatever, is how can we be on the dance floor and on the balcony simultaneously? How can we stay engaged with our kids and be on the dance floor, the so-called dance floor, like be there in the busy morning, trying to get out to school or whatever it is, but at the same time be on the balcony watching ourselves and with that kind of loving objectivity. So when one of our kids starts to mess us around, we don't have to become that person we don't want to be, because often when we start shouting, the interesting thing is we can hear ourselves doing it and like we can't stop. It's awful, isn't it? Just like you hear the person on the balcony is witnessing it, and our being that can be objective like that is witnessing our good stuff and our bad stuff. And
you know, that's making me want to quote something I've heard you say back to yourself. And that's, if it's hysterical, it's historical.
Yeah, you know, that's a quote from my dear friend who I work a lot with the singer Jewel.
Yes.
That's a quote from her. And we travel and work quite a bit together. And that's something that Jewel writes about in her book, her latest book, Never Broken.
Yeah. It resonates so deeply, because it also makes me think about how all of these moments where we have this opportunity to observe ourselves, to be on that balcony, but also to be on the dance floor. These are such relational moments, and it's not just about childhood, it's about every aspect of our lives. But as parents, we really have that balcony in a different way than we have it perhaps in other aspects of our lives.
We can do, and the balcony can either cause us a lot of anguish because we see ourselves behaving in a way that we don't want to behave, and it comes from a lot of unresolved biographical stuff, quite often, and stress, day-to-day stress. So the balcony watcher is always there as a parent, big time, isn't it? The balcony watcher is really strongly there. What I write about in this next book, the Being at Your Best When Your Kids Are at Their Worst book that I'm working on right now, is how can we make that objective watcher from the balcony, how can we put that to good use rather than cause us anguish?
Mm-hmm. Instead of going into a place of shame or judgment. Yeah. So what do you recommend? How could we do that?
There seems to be a couple of things that are right at the top of the list. One of the first things that I've noticed from talking with parents, but also we have approaching 1,000 simplicity parenting educators around the world that we've trained, so we get a lot of feedback. It's not just my opinion. Is that that in a sense, one of the things that we can do to be at our best is to get off this sort of loop where every day has to be spectacular, where every day has to be wonderful, where we lose track of the gift of an ordinary day, and just to allow days to be ordinary and okay, and to let our kids be bored, and that's fine. Because one of the things that triggers a lot of parents is feeling unseen, is feeling like they're not being seen, feeling like they're being taken for granted. And we feel like we're being taken for granted 2, 3, 4 times a day. Every time our kid just drops their clothes on the floor again, drops the towel on the bathroom floor again, gets out the car, closes the door, walks inside without saying thank you again. And we've just turned our lives inside out to try and get that child to soccer practice, and there's no thank you. And in fact, it's worse than that. They walk in the door and just dump their dirty, smelly bag right, where everyone's trying to get in. And so we pick it up and we put it in the washing machine again. And when this goes on, and we extend so much to making their days be perfect, eventually we snap. You can't live your life feeling unseen and unappreciated without there being an equal opposite, really difficult reaction. And it builds up over time. It builds up a toxic charge. Many parents I've spoken to say that really when they think about it, because I have a private counseling practice, and I still do. I wouldn't ever dream of stopping that. And this is the most common piece of feedback is let your kids have downtime. Let them have decompression in their day. Don't try and make every day wonderful. Don't buy into the too much, too soon, too sexy world. Don't try and make everything heightened, because it's exhausting, and then we snap, and then we're not at our best at all.
Right. So dial it back.
And it's hard to dial it back because the supersized family life has become so ubiquitous. It's the new normal. And so it's not easy to just hit the pause button and say, hang on a minute. Do we really need to have, like I've got 2 or 3 kids, and every single one of them are scheduled up to within an inch of their lives? Am I a mother or a father or an unpaid Uber driver? Which one am I? Do we have time to connect as a family and build a safe base?
It strikes me that this is also part of just like this busy making society that we live in right now, where there's so much chaos happening around us that we keep busy so that we don't have to tune into all of it. And we do it as adults, and we keep our kids just as busy as well.
Well, you can't imagine the surprise for me as a young man when I'd been working for quite a long time in Southeast Asia in various war-torn areas, and then particularly in the Thai-Cambodian refugee camps. And I saw a lot of stressed kids, hyper-stressed kids. But we could all anyone could get one's mind around that, because they were coming out of war zones. You might remember the time in the Pol Pot regime and just terrible conflicts in Cambodia. When my time was up there, I was just volunteering there, but when my time was done there, I moved to the West, and there through the door, I had a counseling practice, would come kids from, they were from different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, economic backgrounds, but they looked just like the kids in Cambodia. And I thought, hang on, how are these looking like wartime kids? And what I came to realize is that it wasn't a declared war. It was an undeclared war on childhood and an undeclared war on family life that was going on, only to become so normal that people had stopped noticing it, because the pace of life has become so fast for kids. Very few of us as adults now had to cope with anything like what kids and families have to cope with now. That we have these elevated levels of anxiety and stress, just like the kids in war zones. So what we're doing is that we're not living our days, we're surviving them.
Mm-hmm. What really comes home to me in this is that this slowing down is so much in service to both parents and children. I think often when we tell this story, it's either, oh, you end up being an unpaid Uber driver. I can't do it one more time. Or you hear the story of our kids are so overscheduled. They're, suffering from stress. And I really appreciate in your work how it really makes it so holistic to recognize that it's the relationship between parents and children that comes together when we can honor that for both of us, for all of us, that slowing down and what it really means.
Yeah, we'll almost do anything for our kids, and I think the reason that I wrote Simplicity Parenting first was that, in a sense, we're very, very motivated when we see our kids suffering, and we know at a gut level, we know that something's not right. So many parents all around the world we have coaches on every continent on the planet, every inhabited continent. And it's like, we get this message, no matter what country, that parents' gut instinct is still to protect and provide. And when it's just going too fast, when there's too many demands, and our head is told, no, this is just the way it is. It's just the way it is these days. But our gut brain, our instinctual being is slower but more tenacious, and we know at a gut level, at an instinctual level, that this is not right. It's just so not right that this is moving so fast for our kids, and it's that gut brain, so to speak, which will, if given permission, will speak to us and speak to us clearly. Because an interesting example of this is a good friend and colleague of mine who's an evolutionary neurologist, who I asked a question to a couple of years ago, and I said to her, if we kept off this super fast life that our kids have now in one generation ramped up to, it's a single generation, 20 to 30 years, we're at a whole different level of the pace of life and of the stress and of the hormonal cocktail running through our kids' bodies. If we kept stress off today and said, okay, no more stress, how long would it take for the brain to adapt? Because the brain could adapt. And she came back a couple of weeks later and said, well, of course, we're both right. The brain would adapt, but that's the good news. The bad news is that 900 years, we've basically gotten 900 years ahead of our kids' ability to handle the hormones in their body without going into fight or flight. Right? This thing has become kind of insane.
Yeah.
And I think that the good news is that more and more and more people, and particularly parents, I think we're the first wave to really get it, because our instinct is to protect. There's more and more people who are now saying, this is not right. We need to dial this back, but we also need to live in contemporary society. So there's a balance to be struck here. We can't leave and go live in northern Canada. Actually, I've just come back from there. Don't bother. It's just as bad. We can't opt out. We are opted in just by being born, by living in this world. But how can we be the gatekeepers to be more discerning about what we do as a family and what we don't? There's choices to be made, and I think that's the key to it. Rather than just accepting the new normal of it all, what I'm suggesting is we need to stand up on the balcony there and say, okay, how many activities are coming into our home? How many toys? How many books? And particularly how much screen time? And what's, with iPads and phones and computers and TVs, how much of all this stuff is coming into our home, and how much are we going to limit? And there's a very significant groundswell of parents now who are onto this and who are making choices that may seem outside the mainstream, but the mainstream, I just think we're just basically just slightly, and only slightly, ahead of the curve if we're going to question this.
I'm I'm betting too that you see a lot of blind spots that come up in this process, because I'm thinking of my own experience. That my child was very small, so I didn't go see you. One of the first times you came to New Paltz to speak. So I sat my husband, and he really, your work was one of the first kinds of, certainly the only parenting lecture he's ever been to. And this isn't necessarily his natural world, let's say. And, so we talked about limiting screen time and really being conscious of it. And then he looked at me with all seriousness. He says, well, it's not TV, it's football. Because he loves to watch college football on the weekends. And he was having his daughters watch it with him. And he honestly saw it as, well, it's not like they're just watching cartoons. It's football.
Right.
And that was trying to honor what's important to him and who he is, and also say, but honey, what are we missing here in the bigger picture?
Yeah, the way I look at screen use, and screen use it's like a 25-year unguarded social experiment that's not going so well. And it's social experiments normally have guidelines. Right. And I got to ask, why did Steve Jobs not have screens for his own kids? Right? And when his wife finally, gave an answer to that, because that was a big question, because when it came out in a New York Times interview that his kids had extremely limited exposure to screens, the answer was because he wanted they wanted their kids to be innovative and creative. And and his answer was, how could your kid possibly be innovative and creative if they're sitting there looking at other people's innovations and other people's creativity? Right. We forget that a screen, it might be creative, but it's someone else's creativity. And many of the screen makers and the software makers and the hardware makers, they don't have their kids. They have very limited access to the screens themselves, because these are extremely creative, innovative, adaptable people, and they understand that this is not what you do for kids if you want them to succeed. They just sell it to us poor schmucks, to buy it. My view on screens, though, is that it would be really silly to be anti-screen. I don't want to be anti anything, really. It's that I'm passionately pro-connection, not anti-screen, and I'm pro-connection to four main things. And in a nutshell, I'm passionately pro-connection to nature, really connecting to the natural world for kids. So much is learned about grit, determination, problem solving, wonder, awe in the world. So much is learned when kids can have connection to nature. The second one is connection to friends. And I don't mean friending, I mean friends. So much is worked out in difficult situations with friends. So much joy, so much anguish, so much difficulty, so much social and emotional intelligence comes through interaction with real friends, not friending when someone displeases you and you unfriend them. There's little learning in unfriending someone who causes you discomfort. The third connection is connection to family. Family is just, as we know, is just huge. Do we want the screen to grow our kids up and the values on a screen, or do we want the values of our family? And it's really difficult to compete against the marketing forces, which become marketing values, which become acquisition culture, as opposed to the true north of family values versus the magnetic north of screen values and marketing forces. And the last and final one, and perhaps the deepest, right at the core of these concentric connections, as I refer to them, is connection to oneself. Are my values going to be informed? If I'm a little boy, little girl, or a teenager, are they going to be formed by me? Do I filter all this through my world and now I know who I am? Or am I some two-dimensional cartoon-like character who's got to speak a certain way, be a certain way, wear certain clothing, have certain devices that the marketers try and tell us is absolutely essential? I just don't want our kids' precious little souls and beings to be buried under a toxic landfill of pop culture. Yeah. And so finally, the thing that concerns me about screens is that screens are time bandits. It takes time to have connection with nature. Friends take time. Family take time. And being on my own takes time. And what's happening now is that the average kid in America, there's a Kaiser Family Foundation study from 2011 found that the average American 12 to 18-year-old is exposed to 7.5 hours of screens a day. And that's up now to 9.25, apparently. And so, it's just all those things, nature, friends, family, and self, it takes time. And screens are just robbing us of that time and robbing us of those deep connections. And so for me, it's a question of time for connection. And there's only so much time per day. Do I want to give it to screen, or do I want to give it to family or friends? And for me, there's no choice. I want to give time to my kids for family and nature and friends, and not time for someone else's creativity on a screen.
I love that. And it also brings me to something else that I've heard you talk about. One part is the difference between loneliness and aloneness, because if I'm going to connect to myself, I need time alone. I need to make sure that my kids have that time as well, in addition to connecting to me, and how to make those first steps.
Yeah, well, it's super important that kids know the difference between loneliness and aloneness. And if children are very connected into social networking and very connected into digital communication, often aloneness is confused with loneliness, and so kids get a desperation to be always connected, and to not be connected equates to loneliness. Whereas kids who have real sort of screen time limits in their lives can handle quite well being alone, can play alone, can be alone, can be outside alone, because many of the things that where we have breakthroughs as human beings, just things occur to us, is when we're alone. And it's because we remove all the distractions and we can just get back to what our core is. Now, a little kid is not going to say, I'm returning to my core. A little kid is just messing around, but they make breakthroughs in those moments when they're just messing around, and they're also, frankly, decompressing. They're sort of digesting all the stuff that's come up in the day. Now, if they're really plugged in kids and they're super into social networking, I gotta worry about that, about where is the decompression coming? Where is the digestion coming? It's not that I'm, again, not anti-screen. It's just that screens are everywhere. They're everywhere in the world. They're in libraries. They're in gas stations. They're just all over the place. They're in pretty much every friend's home that our kids will go to has screens. So for me, it's a question of balance. Just like eating has got to be balanced, like waking and time and sleeping time has got to be balanced. There's got to, if there's screen time in a kid's life, there has to be no screen time to have balance. But honestly, the only place we can control no screen time is home.
Yes.
It's the only place. We
can't control it anywhere
charge
else.
of it. No, it's outside our sphere of control. But what's in our sphere of influence is home. And so to introduce screens at home is very questionable. To severely limit, really strictly limit screen time at home is not being weird. It's just doing what we all know is essential for health, and that's just have balance.
Mm-hmm. Right. And yet that balance often begins with the adults, doesn't it? Totally.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a decision we make, but with all the years since 2011 that I've mentioned this figure of 7.5 hours or so a day of screen exposure, and by the way, that didn't include school time exposure.
What?
That was out of school time.
Wow.
I know. The New York Times article said if your kid's awake, they're on a screen. That was the title of it. That was the intimation. But I've met very few parents who will say, yep, that's my kid. It's always someone else's kid. But most parents are, I find, starting to make screen decisions. And if our kid is truly not exposed to 7.5 hours of screens a day, if we really sit down and say, okay, let's just let's work through day by day the last week, we sometimes get a surprise. It can be right up there. But if it's not 7 to 9 hours, then hooray for us, because we've made some decisions. We've probably put some limits in place, and we've been gatekeepers. And that's just really helpful, and it's really hopeful. Mm-hmm. So many parents are now starting to make a questioning the new normal of very low restriction on screen use.
Yeah, I know for us, it was the hardest thing to recognize. My daughter's in public school, and screens were just absolutely part of it since kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And it blew me away at first. And now she's in second grade, and I've realized I've accepted it as normal because it's just the way it is, and I can't fight it. And we control screens at home, but it was a shock to the system at first. And it only took 2 years for me to say, oh, well, that's what they do, I guess.
And my experience is so different. My daughters are in a Waldorf school, and we don't have the same experience. And I have a very, very sensitive child who, if she goes into a restaurant and there's a screen on, she can't eat. And we have to either take food to go or go somewhere else.
I tried to eat with my family at a restaurant with 3 different sporting events playing over my shoulder, and both my husband and daughter were transfixed. And in a way, I recognize that that's because there isn't so much screen time at home. Hopefully that's why it's such a drug. But wow, it's hard to cope with and keep what Kim's saying about the connection alive.
Well, one of our worries with screen use is like, hey, hang on, if our kids don't have screens, won't that make them really, really vulnerable to it? Won't that, just addict them later on? Which is really, because people say, well, screens are the real world. And whenever I hear that said, I said, pardon me, do you understand you just said screens are the real world? And yet I hear it all the time. But, so I took a risk. I wasn't sure. Who can be sure about all this? I really wasn't sure. But with my 2 kids, I raised them without screens. I had a laptop for my work, but it would just be closed. Not surreptitiously when they walked into the room, I'd pretend I didn't have it. I just didn't, it wasn't a part of their life. And the emailing and all that sort of stuff would happen particularly when they were little, it would happen when they were in bed. But the main message I wanted to give them as they grew up is a screen is a tool, and daddy and mama use it as tools. We're not playing games on it. We're not, getting into Facebook and all this sort of stuff. It's a tool. We use it for a short time and then it goes away. So I raised them without screens. And my daughter now is just going on 18, and she got her first computer when she was 16. And she uses it as a tool. Is she addicted to it? Absolutely not. Is she amazed by it? Sort of. But she in her habit life, just the things that she does, she draws, she plays music, she makes stuff, she hangs out, she sits and stares out the window, she goes out into the garden, she has her own plot, little thing going on in the garden. She always has that. Both of them always have. So in a sense, they've been raised up, they've been grown with other habits, other things that are just normal to do. So when screens come into their lives, it's okay, it's fine, but they keep doing that other stuff because it's healthy habit. So the screen doesn't dominate in the earlier years, because if you've got a screen in a little child's life and they're spending a lot of time on an iPad, pretty hard because of the dopamine levels that rise on a screen to ask a child to take part in family chores, because family chores don't give you pleasure, whereas the dopamine levels from gaming give you pleasure. And it's ironic because, in my private practice, people come to me all the time with some pretty tricky discipline issues, kids that are just blowing their parents off. And one of the things that I ask a parent if they really want to get serious about this, do they want to go on a 1-month screen-free brain reset? And a bunch of parents have got to just they're pulling their hair out. So they say, okay, I'll do it, I'll try it. And it's amazing how rapidly, how many kids become more biddable, become easier to handle, will follow directions. And parents say, well, that is incredible. Well, but actually, I'm pleased things change, but it's not incredible. It's very credible. Because what's happening is that the dopamine levels of the child are now starting to drop. And that means not everything has to be pleasurable, because it's not pleasurable to clean up your room. Not always, but it is pleasurable to do it with mum and dad and fold things up and chat when you're doing it. But that takes time. And so it's time and dopamine. Dopamine levels up, time level down. Whereas when you have a low or no screen, it's building connection.
It's building the connection. It's building, as you sometimes talk about it, it's that sibanu and the nahona, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's just such a beautiful, such a beautiful story. There's so many beautiful stories. I could listen to you for days, Kim.
But that would get boring, believe me. Yeah, it was a time when I was traveling in Africa, in southern Africa in particular, and I would often hear at my room where I'd often stay overlooked a marketplace, and I would hear in the morning the market folks setting up very, very early in the morning, and they would be calling out Subanu, Subanu, Subana, depending male and female, and there'd be this greeting, I see you, I see you. That's what Subana means, I see you. And then the refrain would come, you would hear it, you Subanu, and the refrain would come, Nahona. Nahona means, so now I am here, brother or sister, I am here. I'm only here. In Africa, you can only be there in this greeting. I can only be here if you see me. I see you, okay, so now I am here. You can only be truly here when you're seen. And this is what living a balanced, simple family life brings, is that it brings connection. It brings to a family, we see each other. We try and remove as many distractions to us seeing each other. Because I know it's a cliche, but the childhood years go by in an eye blink. My eldest daughter just left for Germany just last week, and she's gone, and she's up, and she's away, and we'll see her some more, but man, where did those 18 years go? And my younger kids, going on 16, and these years go by so fast. Why would we not want to absolutely optimize this feeling of we see each other, I see you, and this feeling of nohona, of and I am seen. This is what I think lies at the kind of deepest instinct of every parent, is the wish to see their children and to have the children feel they are present and loved.
I think, feeling that we matter is such a primal human need. It is where connection stems from. It's everything about attachment. I also see in my practice, and I wonder if you see this too, Kim, that some really struggle with being seen.
Well, you see, you mentioned attachment, and what we have now going on in much of contemporary society is rather than have a parent-child relationship and an attachment in that way, what we see is what I think of as a horizontal attachment, where parents are attaching to children as buddies, as siblings. So we have a generation of children being raised without a loving, authoritative presence, where parents, we're fed this stuff on screens, particularly, where to be a successful parent means you've got to be friends with your kid. I have no problems being friendly with my child, but am I friends with them? No, No, that's not my aim. My aim is to give them the loving boundaries that they need in life so that they can feel secure. And when we have a horizontal attachment rather than a vertical attachment, there's a problem, because kids will attach to other kids horizontally. That's fine. They'll always have friends and peers and all that sort of stuff. But when the vertical attachment comes to a parent, and you have the vertical crossing, intersecting with the horizontal, that's the formation of character. That's the formation of self. When you have kids who have friends who consistently call them buddies or bud or bro, and the kids call their parent dude, and you've got all this sort of stuff going on, it's very, very confusing to a kid, very confusing indeed, because then when they hit school and you've got teachers who are not bros, they're not buddies, the teachers are teachers. And then you have a child, they don't mean to be naughty, they don't mean to be disrespectful, it's just that they don't recognize an adult. They see a teacher there calling for the class to come to order, come to quiet, they're going to get on now. And the kids just keep right on talking. And the teacher kind of reminds them, and they keep right on talking. It's because the kids are horizontally attached, and the teacher is just a part of it's a buddy, right? We're all buddies. And it sets our kids up for a lot of trouble at school. And they don't mean to be disrespectful. It's just that what alternatively we can do is have, like I write about in the Soul of Discipline book, we can have these loving limits that change as a child grows. Of course, they expand, but it's very much a pause point for me when I feel that that I'm putting too much emphasis on being friends with my kids as opposed to being friendly. I don't want to have a family that is basically a sort of thinly veiled Lord of the Flies scene going on.
It puts the connection and that placement back on being a guiding force, being someone who can hold that stability.
Yeah, as our kids grow, the metaphor I use is moving from the governor to the gardener to the guide. And when our kids are little, they just need us to be the governor of the family state. And it's it's Rhode Island, right? It's a little state. They need us to make the decisions. They don't need open-ended choices. They need you may choices. In other words, you may choose between this cereal and this cereal, and that choice is okay with me. That's a you may choice. That's a governor-guided choice. But when they're growing up, when they're sort of 10, 11, 12 years old, that's when we move to the gardener stage, where a good gardener, and the reason I use that metaphor is a good gardener is listening in, watching, listening, checking the soil, checking the climate, looking at the sky. But when and really listening, just like our kids really need listening to. When they're 9, 10 years old, my kids would hear it all the time, over and over, and ask them what's their plan, what would they like to do. You can tell me your plan. I'm listening really, really carefully. Then they tell me the plan, and then myself or my wife make the decision. See, a good gardener will listen, watch, but then know when to plant, know when to harvest. And I think a lot with our teenage kids, our 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, we've got to relieve them of the stress of making big life decisions because they're not there yet. They're just not there. But do they need listening to? Oh, yeah. Otherwise, they'll get very upset and say, don't treat me like a baby. And they're right. So then the final step is when our kids are growing up and they're 16, 17, 18, 19. That's when we need to be in the guide principle, because a good guide knows the terrain, but a good guide, some of the best conversations I've ever had with a teenager have been about their direction, because teenagers can be spectacularly disinterested in our opinions, but they're very, very interested in their direction. So if something happens that's not so great, if your son or your daughter gets involved in with alcohol and it goes to a party and was drinking, then the conversation is around, is that a distraction to where you want to be in life, or is that a direction? And sweetheart, that's a distraction. Let's just talk about how we can get you where you want to go with a minimum of distractions. And that, for me, is the key to it all. But as a society, we've got it back to front. We're parenting little kids like they're 18, and then when they get to being 17, 18, and it's all cut and loose and not going so well, we try and haul in the boundaries and treat them like a governor. We've kind of got it back to front.
Yeah. I'm thinking of that guide question, and that's such a thing that I think as parents, as adults, we're all looking at all the time too. Is that a distraction or a direction, right? Like when a parent is on a digital device, is that a distraction or a direction?
Well, our kids, it's like we're distracted parenting. Mm-hmm. It's like there's distracted driving, and we know how dangerous that is. But so is distracted parenting. If we're with our kids and we're at the park and a text comes in and it pings in our pocket, if we pay attention to that ping in our pocket, our kids will ping even louder. They will. They realize that being good and being compliant and doing stuff that's nice and cute, that'll get us a little bit of attention as a child. But what gets us a ton of attention and quick is to be outrageous. And so a lot of parents, what we're doing is we're sort of setting ourselves up a little bit, because our kids are in what I think of as the attentional wars. They are really upping the ante of their behavior so that they can get our attention, because our attention is becoming so distracted with devices.
Mm. Oh, that's so clear.
Yeah, it's so real.
Kim, one of the things that we like to ask all of our guests on this podcast, and it might just be a good landing place for us, is how did you get into this transformational work? What relationships or stories in your lives led you to this place where you now bring this transformation to other people? You bring this awareness of what are our distractions and what direction do we want? How can you simplify? What were the moments in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's so universal. You see, my work didn't start in the West. It started in war-torn areas of Southeast Asia. And so for me, this was universal. It is, and it remains universal. I mean, my books have been translated into, I think it's like 27 or something languages now. And I don't say that to be self-grandizing. It's universal, that we are getting the message that we've reached peak stress, if you know what I mean. There's peak oil, and now there's peak stress, and we've reached it. I really don't say that to be dramatic. I don't know scientifically how much more we can handle on a day-to-day level. Something has to shift for us to be emotionally sustainable. I don't mean just sustainable. We can drive a Prius and buy Birkenstocks and recycle as much as we like, and that's great. That's all very important, of course. But there's also just sustainability in terms of our emotions. And so what really brought me into this work was realizing the universality of it, realizing how just across the globe, it's almost like, some of us fight for environmental change and the burning off of the layers of the earth, literally through global warming. There's been as we know, but my stance, my choice in my life has been to say, you know what, there's also a stripping back of the layers around human beings. There is a burning off of the atmosphere of the layers around a family, and there's just too much coming at us, and we have to not just deal with climate change on the planet, but actually deal with climate change within the family, and actually bring a sense of cooling all that heat that is coming back to family life. Because I know it's a cliche, but there is nothing more important than our children. And we talk about what's going to happen for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren in terms of the planet. And that's super important. But we are already at inundation at family life. We're actually about 2 generations ahead of global warming in terms of family warming. We are already at that point now. And that's what gets me up in the morning, and that's what keeps me being as not so much an eco warrior, but a warrior for the protection of family life.
Thank you so much, Kim, for this opportunity just to sit with your wisdom. And I know our listeners are going to have so many opportunities to look at themselves and their families, and hopefully with a lot of compassion and gentleness, because you certainly bring that to this conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Of course, it's a real honor to speak with you in the community.
Thank you. Is there any way that our listeners can get a hold of you, can get connected to your work and your trainings?
Yeah, in the normal old way through the screens, of course, that we don't have. And yeah, really. But, screens are a tool, and the tool that we have is the Simplicity Parenting website. So just Simplicity Parenting is the portal through which anyone interested in looking a little further into this, looking at our trainings in particular, because our trainings are simple little trainings. To become a parent educator is a very simple training. I mean, it would be ironic if it was complicated, right? And so it's a very simple training. We also have a Simplicity community where that's new, and that's where I'm really delighted, because parents who have got these conundrums about, hey, everything's coming at us too fast, it's booming, it's buzzing, how do we simplify, how do we balance? We've got a Simplicity community now which is very busy and active with parents supporting parents in how to balance and simplify their lives, and that can also be accessed through simplicityparenting.com.
Oh, wonderful. And you have a book coming out next year, I believe it is. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a couple of books scheduled. The Being at Your Best When Your Kids Are at Their Worst book should be out 2018. And I'm really looking forward to that, because that focuses on us as adults, whereas my previous books have focused on our kids.
Oh, so wonderful. Thank you so much for all the light and the work that you bring into the world.
Oh, and to you.
Thank you.
And please remember, this August, Revision, Explore Your Stories, Shape Your Future is going to be the first Practice of Being Seen retreat for therapist healers. Find out more at practiceofbeingseen.com/events. We want to thank today's sponsor, Plum Tea Deluxe. Do you love trying new teas? Well, treat yourself to a Plum Deluxe Tea of the Month subscription. For only $10 a month, you receive hand-blended, all-organic, loose-leaf tea thoughtfully chosen for the season. Tea Club members also enjoy special benefits like gift swaps, free shipping on all purchases, and access to a very loving tea community. A tea subscription also makes a fantastic gift for clients, colleagues, and friends. Caffeine-free options are always available too. Visit plumteadeluxe.com/tea and join now. We're so thrilled to have Plum Deluxe as a member of the Practice of Being Seen community, and we have a feeling that you're going to want to be a part of their community too. Have a look over at their website. You will be amazed by all the different flavors. Rebecca and I had a ball choosing our favorites. To receive special offers from our sponsors, including Plum Deluxe, we invite you to visit practiceofbeingseen.com and sign up for our newsletter.
Enjoy your tea. For more great content, check out practiceofbeingseen.com and spread the word by subscribing, rating, and reviewing the podcast. Music written and performed by Christopher Ferris and produced at Kidney Stone Studio.